Okay, cool. So yeah, we're going to be talking about designing for accessibility at scale today. So a little bit of just like background on Design Sprint Singapore. There are a bunch of Google Design Sprint chapters all over the world. You'll know this if you've attended our previous events. Basically, we just like to share ideas about design new things, design sprint stuff, and more. And you can go to designsprinkit.withgoogle.com to find out more. So yeah, we're all over the world, and we're affiliated with Design Sprint APAC. So you can join the Slack channel if you saw the link in our meetup group as well. So hello, I'm Jill. For those of you who haven't met me, hi. Currently, I'm an Automatic product designer working on the WooCommerce product. And Sheehan.
Hello.
I'm
supposed to introduce myself?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm currently a researcher at SB Digital. Yeah.
Yep. And so if you have any questions or any things going wrong for you, or you need to talk, you want to ask any questions or whatever, just feel free to ping us in the chat or ping us directly. Yeah. So, oh yeah, this is my like pitch. The company that I'm at is hiring. We're the company behind WooCommerce, WordPress.com, Tumblr, and more, and we are hiring. So if anyone's interested in working with a fully distributed team, you can go to automatic.com/about and check it out. So for today, I'm extremely, extremely excited to be introducing Gloria and Immanuel to y'all today. Just like as a precursor, we took a peek at the content earlier, well, last week. And I have to say, after I saw it, I was just super excited. I mean, I'm not gonna like stress Gloria and Manny out now by like hyping it up so much, but I'm just so excited with the stuff they're gonna share today because the problems that they have been solving are so interesting, and the kind of approaches they're taking were really very informative and useful for me personally. So really excited for them to take it away and to share with us about how they design for accessibility at scale, working at GovTech, which, well, I'll let them tell you more about that. But yeah, so take it away, please, Gloria and Manny.
Sounds great.
Right.
Thank you, Jill. Manny,
Thanks, Jill. Yep. Hey, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Hey, good morning to those in Singapore and evening to those elsewhere. Yeah, we're super excited to share with you today about our journey in designing for accessibility at scale, like a journey that has been going on for the past year and a half. A little bit about ourselves to start with. Let's see if the clicking thing works. Aha, it does. Yeah, I'm Gloria, and I'm a product designer in the government digital services, like a particular division in GovTech where we build tech products and services like to serve citizens and businesses in Singapore. Manny?
Yeah, and I'm a designer working. Yeah, I'm a design researcher working with Gloria, along with the identity products in GovTech.
Yep, and together we work on this product called SingPass Mobile. And for those who are not acquainted with the product, SingPass Mobile is basically part of our national digital identity family, which is a product where every Singaporean has a digital identity that you can use to access a bunch of public as well as private services. So for example, if you're applying for a public apartment or checking your pension or registering for your passport, you sort of all go through SingPass and SingPass Mobile if possible. And this also relates to a little bit of why we started like working on inclusion and accessibility, because while we were like on paper like doing relatively well and it felt like we were achieving some sort of product market fit, we've reached around half of our total user base in Singapore right now and are slowly growing. But it felt like we weren't necessarily being very intentional in thinking about the people at the edges and how do we sort of design and ensure that they are also able to access. Since SingPass and SingPass Mobile is a gateway, if the gateway itself is not accessible, then none of the services within are. So that sort of kickstarted our journey in inclusion and accessibility, and that's what we're going to share with you today.
All right, before we begin, here's a quick fun fact, because you'll be seeing this A11Y thing all around. So A11Y, or some people pronounce it as ally, ally, is a short form for accessibility. If you're wondering why A11Y, it's because there is 11 letters between A and Y. So that's how they shorten the word accessibility in the accessibility circles. So you'll be seeing this term ally or ally around in our talk today. So like what Gloria mentioned, there is a very strong motivation that we have for designing for accessibility in the Singapore government and in the government digital services. And really the vision that we have here is that every citizen has an empowered access to digital services from the government. And the way we view this is really three large areas that we want to look at when we are designing for accessibility. First, which is user impact. And really it's about empowering every citizen of every ability with empowered access to digital services, really fulfilling our mission as a public servants. And we also see accessibility as really part of product excellence, really defining excellence as building for maximum impact for our users. That excellence is a culture, not a checklist, not so much motivated by compliance, but motivated by excellence. And lastly, that accessibility is an innovation opportunity, not a problem. And if you reframe that, right, you will see that accessibility becomes a very good lens to look at how to design and build creatively and differently. Instead of saying cannot, right, we really want to say why not to accessibility. So after hearing all this, I'm wondering, so where do we begin? Do we start top down? Do we go from bottom up? And I believe that some stakeholders may ask, okay, give us some numbers, to make a case. But the numbers alone aren't going to make a strong business case, or will it? Let's find out. So when you start a conversation about inclusion and accessibility, the first place that people would start looking is looking for different sensory or dexterity abilities. If you start here, right, it sounds like a very small number of people excluded. In the World Health Organization, the stats of people living with disability is 15% of the world's population. In Singapore, it's about 3.4 adult residents that live with a disability. If you're wondering why the number is so small, probably it may be underreported in Singapore, but this is the numbers that we got from MSF so far. So if you start from here, you'll see the numbers seem really small. But let's expand our lens a little bit. If you expand our lens to recognize language as a point of exclusion, right, you will see that the number increases. The last figure that we got is 37 of Singapore residents actually put English as their primary language at home. And if you look at that and you flip the figures around, the number increases by quite a lot. And if you also look at, if you expand the lens further, and you realize that actually exclusion also happens to users in the social, psychological, and emotional spaces as well. And when you see that, the lens expands much further. But if you expand the lens even further, you'll start realizing that everybody has a different challenge. There is no such thing as, when it comes to people, no such thing as normal. Everybody is different. Everybody has a different access challenge or access barrier. And when you see that, exclusion can happen to a larger group of people than we imagine. If you look at this slide, I'm pretty sure we can find ourselves in one of the characters or the archetypes that is mentioned here. So when you see that, you realize that the number increases by quite a lot. But let's not just talk about numbers. Let's talk about disability. Everybody does experience disability at some point of their lives. The interactions we design with technology depend heavily on what we see, we hear, we say, or we touch. And it's really based on an assumption that we have all these senses and abilities fully enabled all the time, which is not true for everyone. If you look at disability, it is context dependent, and our experience of disability can either be permanent. So for example, if a person has a use of only one arm, that's a permanent disability. And you look at that, that's around 26,000 people in the USA. But if you expand the lens further, and you realize that disability, the experience of disability can be temporary. If you get an arm injury, if you hurt your arm quite severely, or you fracture your arm, then you only have access to one arm. But if you expand the lens further, the experience of disability can be situational. If you're a parent and you are holding your child, you also have access to one arm. Let's talk about something normal that you do daily, which is grocery shopping. If you're holding a lot of bags with one arm, you only have access to one hand. And if you're going to scan the safe entry code to the NTUC, right, or the supermarket with one hand, that's something you realize that you are situationally disabled at that point of time. So it's really safe to say that everybody experiences disability at some point of their lives. If you step out of your house today, you'll recognize that disability is all around. If you go to your neighborhood coffee shop and we're all masked up, right, you realize that you are excluded verbally in terms of speech because of the mask, and also hearing's impaired because the uncle can't hear you when you're ordering your coffee. So it's important to recognize that disability is not a personal attribute, but it's a mismatched interaction between a person and its environment. And if you recognize that, right, then inclusion means matching interactions between the user and the environment. Okay, but we get it. It sounds really hard to convince the stakeholders with just these numbers alone, right? And we've been there too. And today we want to share our journey on how we actually build accessibility within our teams. And we all have to start somewhere. If not top down, why not bottom up? And if you look at this picture of this gigantic snowball, right, it didn't start this way. This snowball started really small. And the hypothesis that we had is, how do we move enough people organically to start things snowballing? You know, how do you build a big snowball? You start by rolling a very small one first. So we're going to share a little bit about the small steps that we took towards inclusion and accessibility through the small things of experimenting, changing processes, and shifting mindsets. So let's go to the experiment part. Really, it's about moving from cannot to why not. And in our experiments, what we really learned is that every small experiment matters. So let's take a look at Ally as this little snowball. To get this snowball rolling, we started small, but we really ran experiments in these 4 broad areas, and each experiment gave us learnings that stacked upon one another. So there's the experiment on understanding, motivation, resources, community, and let me go a little bit deeper into these experiments that you ran. So in the space of understanding, and one of the very first things that we did was to meet people from the different disability communities in Singapore. And the intent really was to understand the digital experience of people with disabilities. We had conversations to understand how they use tech, and really seeing their interactions with assistive tech really gave us a very powerful insight onto how do they use technology on a daily basis. We also got feedback on our products. The biggest takeaway from this experiment was building empathy with our users. The thing is, everybody in Singapore uses some level of SingPass, and these people are our users, and we got greater empathy with them, but we also developed relationships with them. And one thing that's really important that we learned here is relationships with our users are important. We are still in contact with some of the people that we spoke, and they have been really great teachers and friends in this journey. Next, it was an experiment on motivation. We had a hunch, that we can grow motivation in people, but we were wondering how. So what we did was we actually ran a workshop with our engineering team to experience our own app, right, with other modes of access. So here are some of our iOS engineers, right, and we asked them to use the SingPass mobile app using VoiceOver. So VoiceOver is the iOS screen reader software. And with VoiceOver, they really got an experience of what it's like to experience their own product with this mode of access. And obviously, everyone struggled to use our very own product using VoiceOver. What was important here, right, was it really gave them an insight to how difficult their product can be used with a different mode of access. And we found out the reason why accessibility wasn't high on people's radar is because they didn't know that this was a problem in the first place. So really having awareness builds a motivation for our engineering team, and we really showed them how exclusion feels like. Another thing that we ran was with other product teams in government digital services, that's our division. And we showed them this little cool disability simulator called Funkify. So what Funkify does is it's a browser-based plugin, and it really simulates different disabilities on a browser. And our teams obviously also struggled too. And the powerful experience that came out of it was they realized that, man, this isn't easy, huh? Using the web with different barriers is really not easy. And it really gave them a motivation to audit their apps and to see how else people are having challenges accessing their apps. A caveat here, okay, so yes, there's simulators and there's screen readers, right? But it doesn't replace direct user testing. So it's very important that you still speak with people with disabilities to really see how they use your app in their context. Even for screen readers, right? Different people use screen readers very differently. And in the PC platform, there are very different screen reader software as well. So I just want to caveat that while there's a simulator, please don't speak to your users directly. On another point, we also experimented with community, and it's really about setting up a community of practice to rally like-minded folks. There's this very famous saying that people have been sharing, right? If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together, right? And this was our attempt to bring everyone together. We set up a little chat group and we called it the Inclusive Design Guild. Sounds very epic. But what really happened was it was an opportunity for people to just share knowledge. We had a colleague that was asking about how do they design for accessibility with address search field in their product. And we had another colleague who himself is part of the visually impaired community, right? That shared good practices as well. We also ran surveys among our product teams within our division to find out like what are the challenges they face baking inclusion and accessibility in their products. And those insights gave us a kind of material to understand the different challenges product teams faced, in baking. What encourages us is that when we knew what they were challenged with, we had kind of a compassion to why they are not baking in accessibility as quick as we are hoping for them to do so. And it really gave us some empathy with the teams. Lastly, we also experimented with resources. And we realized that there's a myriad of accessibility resources out there, and there's worldwide, right? There's so much good content out there. But the irony here, right, is some of this content people are unaware of, especially our colleagues, right? And what we really did was to make accessibility content accessible for our colleagues. So we really gathered all these resources, links. We found out there's great playbooks from our counterparts at UK, gov.uk, and we gathered it into this big list to share with our colleagues. We ran workshops with them as well. We also did our very own playbook internally with the Singapore context in mind that spoke to the devs, to the designers, to the comms team, and that really gave resources for them to aid the cause. We also built our own accessibility testing tool, so we call it Purple Hats, and that really helped. It's like an auto crawler that really audits our products with a first level of understanding where are accessibility gaps. For some of you, I'm thinking like, wow, you all built your own accessibility testing tool. I don't have the resource to do that. No worries. There are actually free tools out there that we have tested, we have gathered as well, that does a decent job. The reason why we built our own tool is really to support our own context and also kind of automate the process a little bit for continuous delivery. But fret not, there are free resources for you guys to access as well, which we will share at the end of this talk. So having shared all that, what's the takeaway we have for experimentation? What we really want to share is that everyone's context is different. Your organization and my organization may face very different challenges. But how do we find out what challenges can be best tackled, right? It's really through experimentation. We learn and we understand by doing. My challenge for everyone is really to treat accessibility like a design challenge. Run sprints to understand, and rapidly prototype accessibility to identify your team's needs.
Yes, and after we've learned so much and we saw that some of these experiments were gaining traction within our division, we decided to think about how do we bake that the learnings into the product development process, so that like accessibility doesn't stay as an afterthought but becomes sort of a foundation of what we do. So we started codifying some of our work and best practices. Let me click. Okay, yes, it moves into sort of a proto process, like across the sort of 4 major stages of the product development cycle. And the reason for this is so that we can help people translate their intent, which is like, okay, we want our services to be accessible and inclusive, into specific and concrete actions that will eventually lead into outcomes. And to make it a little bit more manageable for the teams, like we decided to break it down into like a level 1 and a level 2 kind of thing that you can do. And here are a few different things that we did, sort of to express like what the process could be like. And today I'm just going to share with you like a little bit of each of the steps in the process. So to start with, like we'll look at sort of the research part of things. Yes, there you go. So, as usual, we'll do our user research like for the various products and features that we are rolling out. Then we started to also include diverse users in our studies. So instead of recruiting from our usual research pool, like we also reached out specifically to social services agencies that cater for the different groups of individuals with different abilities. So for example, the Singapore Association for the Visually Handicapped, to find users for our usual feature testing. So over here, for example, I'd like to share you this study that we did on facial recognition. And in this study, like the reason why we decided to also include people with visual disabilities is because like we suspected that there was a lot of like visual cues that you needed to align your face with. So like how does someone deal with that? And of course, like after we did the study, for example, with one of our users right here, like we found a specific affordances that we could now introduce to the rest of the product that everyone can benefit from. But also we started seeing like internal changes that started happening. So for example, yes, there you go. A project manager, like who also accompanied our researcher on this study, commented at the end of it that I didn't realize until today, that day, that someone who is completely blind will actually use our product. So in their mind, like there was just no possible universe in which that happened. But like once we showed them that that was the case, you can imagine like what sort of like changes in mindset like that can kick off for him that also had a lasting effect. Then on the design side, like we started to make sure that we were accounting for the edges and not just like leaving it out. So we did this by 2 major ways. Like the first way is ensuring that at the end of every design spec that we handed off to the engineers, we had a specific section on accessibility. So that section would have different considerations depending on the product. For example, in this one where we were speccing out the digital identity card, like within SingPass Mobile, we ensured to have a section on screen reader usability, which is how sort of VoiceOver and Android TalkBack would read back this sort of thing on the screen, like to our users. So we'll sort of talk about the sequence, the order, the focus, and also like dark mode for low contrast situations. The other thing that has sort of emerged is actually by an intern, like who also interned with us this past summer, which is like an accessibility checklist where like before you sort of ship off your feature, like ensure that you look through at least the baseline levels of accessibility, things like color contrast, things like keyboard navigation, just so that like we don't accidentally ship out something that we never consider accessibility for. Again, we'll also share this at the end, I think. Awesome. Then the next piece, on the development side, of course, we started to bake in testing for accessibility throughout the process. So when we started our journey like in accessibility, what we did at first was a quick audit of our SingPass Mobile key flows to pick up like a bunch of like accessibility issues, and then also prioritize them against like the impact as well as the effort it takes to fix the product. And like over the subsequent sprints, and we were run by an agile sprint cycle, start to like fix things incrementally here and there, here and there. And after we sort of reached like the baseline that we wanted, like we made sure that like during sprint reviews and QA, we were specifically looking out for screen reader compatibility as well as other accessibility issues, so that again, like we don't just like, you know, let things fall by the sidelines. And I think this is one step that we usually forget, like as a product team or engineering team, like the communications of the product to our users. So we also worked closely with our communications team to aid the sense of digital independence, because after all, like when we talk about inclusion and accessibility, what is it? It's about the ability for a user to be able to like use their services and feel independent while doing so. So as Manny mentioned just now, we distilled our learnings into a playbook for others to use, and we shared it with comms, sharing about like what we thought were these various states of digital independence, and providing a few sets of personas that people could use while they were crafting their communications material to the public. So the nice thing about process is that once you have a process, it's about the things that happen outside of the process that that become like kind of wonderful and unexpected, and it's where sort of the magic happens. So let me share with you a little bit of a story of SingPass Mobile and what happened after we instituted this process, so to say. So to start with, like in the very early part of our accessibility journey, we as a team decided to support on iOS the Siri shortcuts feature, because we felt that it was a pro-accessibility feature that enabled our users with perhaps motor disabilities, like and maybe used voice commands like to access services, to use our services. So we like, you know, instituted it and everything. And then COVID happened, and we also instituted this other feature, which is the safe entry check-in. For our non-Singaporean friends out there, like it is our nationwide contact tracing system, which means that like every time you enter a venue, let's say a shopping mall or a restaurant, you scan the QR code to check into that place, and like you check out afterwards as well. So we had these two things over there, but we sort of forgot about the Siri shortcuts, to be completely honest, but our engineer didn't. So he decided to also ensure that our safe entry check-in was accessible using Siri shortcuts. And this is a very, very simple thing, but then we saw these interesting things that started happening from it. So firstly, like the VI community started talking about these features like kind of organically. So here we have a user who recorded like a podcast and a YouTube video like explaining how to use safe entry, like using Siri shortcuts and voice over, because for them, like finding a QR code may not necessarily be the easiest task, and they were sharing about it within their own community, and like it's sort of exciting to see this thing grow and take on its own life. We also saw the broader community take note that, like, you know, some of these works were gaining tractions within the communities that we don't necessarily think too much about usually, like the edges, as we talked about. So this was like a Reddit post, for example, on safe entry. Reddit is a fascinating place to get product feedback. And the last part, like what started happening was also like some of our local social media celebrities, as well as like the press, started picking up on how this feature combined with iOS actually like brought even more convenience to everyone. So Mr. Brown, which is one of our social media celebrities, went to say that like with iOS 14, you're now able to use an accessibility feature to double tap at the back of your thing to open up the QR code scanner, or triple tap to check out. And this is only possible because like early on in the process, we had like started thinking about Siri shortcuts and accessibility. But now that we have sort of designed for the edges, like it sort of benefits everyone in the middle to have a more convenient and a more seamless experience. So this is what we believe in, like in terms of, you know, we talked about product excellence and we talked about innovation. This is a very, very, very small example, right? But you can see how designing for the edges can really bring benefits for everyone in the middle as well. So our takeaway from this process is that, like, even though as designers, like, we can sort of we can sort of push things along, like at the start and catalyze things, but accessibility is really a cross-functional effort. And once you have like everybody in the team feel a sense of ownership and responsibility, to ensure that users at the edges are catered for and designed for and feel like they belong to the product, that you get all of these amazing things that can happen that benefits the whole product overall and like everyone who is using it. Hold on. Okay, great. Mindset. So, we've already talked about this whole process and sort of step A, step B, step C, but it's hard to sort of keep processes sustainable. Like if we don't talk about how do you make it into mindset, and how do we sort of shift the mindset of people from, okay, we need to comply to accessibility standards, to we're motivated, we want to do stuff. And our sort of major experiment in this was this thing called Accessibility Awareness Week that we ran in July, so a couple of months ago. And we ran it for our division. It was a combination of different folks coming together, people who were interested in accessibility, people who had a little bit more experience in it, and people who like didn't know anything about it but wanted to learn. And we did a bunch of different things, be it curating resources, like having Zoom conversations, I'll dive into that, or even having like an illustration library that people could use. What we were trying to do with the Accessibility Awareness Week was to develop the 4 critical ingredients that we've identified at the start to be really critical in driving accessibility at scale that Manny talked about. So understanding, motivation, resources, community. And the way that we did it was through a bunch of different things in between. So one thing that we wanted to focus on to build motivation and resources was to expose individuals to the experiences of people at the edges, as well as expose individuals to key accessibility concepts and best practices. So on the left, you would see us having an accessibility conversation with our community partners. So this was sort of a Zoom call where we had our friends from SAVH on board to explain to us how, or like to show us actually, how they were using some of our government services using their assistive technology, in this case, a screen reader. And on the right, we ran a bunch of accessibility workshops that were pitched across different levels. This, for example, was one by our software engineer friend who's also from the VI community, to explain what best practices in semantic HTML are in terms of like labeling, ARIA, so on and so forth. And when we also wanted to make sure that learning accessibility was a hands-on thing, like we felt that would build the understanding and community piece. Because one thing that we were hearing from our friends from the guild was that like, yeah, I kind of get all of these concepts, but like, I feel a little bit scared to dip my toe in the water. So we decided to run an accessibility egg hunt, which is essentially an internal bug bounty where our teams that could basically form teams to find and fix accessibility bugs. So this is the first time we were running it, and we had a promising 12 teams sign up for it across 50 participants. And the number of bugs that were found and fixed were way higher than we expected, to be completely honest. But what really struck us was more about getting people dip the toes in the water, so that for the next time that they do it for their own product, it becomes easier and they can do it without, this is the training wheels of sorts. And after we did this experiment, this more or less huge experiment, we saw the promising beginnings of some mindset shifts away from compliance and more toward motivation. So there was an increased level of empathy for accessibility issues faced by different user groups. There's an increased sense of we want to use what we learn and spread it across post accessibility week. So it's not just about that week itself. And also we saw that maybe some people were starting to be convinced, like, you know, this is not just for show, it's not just for CSR, it's not an afterthought, as a team lead, as a tech lead would say. It is more of like any other engineering foundation, the same reason why we write tests. And this particular team lead had actually identified like one of their developers to be an accessibility lead, so that like across time, like they are able to also bake accessibility to their processes and start changing the culture within their team itself. So our takeaway here is that accessibility can seem like something that is very onerous, like very like, you know, processy, but really like once you make people want to do it and not just have to do it, like it starts becoming a lot easier and organic and actually much more scalable and sustainable as well.
Yeah, so really it's about building momentum through incremental wins. If I bring back a little snowball again, right? It's important that we don't see our wins in isolation, you know, with all the experiments and all the successes. If you are running through your sprint and you see that there are successes, don't see it in isolation, but see that you can stack those wins and you will build momentum through these incremental wins. And hopefully you'll see a larger snowball at the end of this. And when you stack those wins, it also helps you get your foot in the door. So having shared all that, what's next for us? You know, we have run through the experiment, process, and mindset, like processes, right? What's really on our minds is really building in mindset and structures within our organization. Thinking about how can we start setting up some pillars to really help accessibility flourish within our organization and beyond us. That accessibility is not going to be a personality-driven thing, but really, like what we said, it's moving beyond compliance to motivation among our colleagues. What we're also looking at is to continue to prove value to our users, especially our friends over at the different PWD communities, right? And we're hoping that more stories like the one we shared about Mr. Brown happened. We're also looking to legitimize accessibility as a formal practice within our organization. We have gained some momentum, but we are still very early in this long journey, and we are definitely happy to chat more about our journey post this talk. So we shared about our why, you know, why do we design for accessibility, you know, within our organization. It's really about the user impact, really about product excellence, and really about looking at it from an innovation angle. We also shared our process on the how, right? How do we experiment? How do we shift and change processes, mindsets, and building structures? But I really want to leave you guys with a quote from this master of change himself. And the journey that you might take may look very different from us, you know, but I really hope that our story inspires you to start rolling your own snowball of accessibility. What Bruce Lee has shared is really very inspiring, because the encouragement to be like water, you know, to adjust to the object, whatever challenges you may face, right? How do you find your way around it or through it, you know, and really believe that you can be like water as you start designing for accessibility in your organization. And really hope that this talk has inspired you. Thank you very much.
Okay,
if you're interested for more resources, we have a QR code over here. And if you want to continue the conversation with us, that's our handle. And last credit, so the illustrations you've seen in our deck, you know, of all the different scenarios, the uncle that has the mask on, was actually done by our very good friend, Someone Draws. Go check her out on Instagram, because we kind of created a little like a illustration library, and she was the brainchild behind that. Thank you.
Ting Wan's in the room. Hi, Ting Wan.
Hi, Ting Wan.
Now for sure. Okay, thank you so much, Manny and Gloria, for that amazing session. I especially love the point that you made about how there is no typical user, and I think that that's just something that we have to keep in mind all the time. So it's not over yet. We have a bunch of questions, really, really great questions that have come in through Pigeonhole, and Sharon will be sharing the screen for that. So we're going to see the most upvoted questions first. Don't worry if you didn't get a chance to get to the QR code, which Gloria and Manny shared. We will be sharing the links in the chat and after the event as well. So yeah, okay, so these are the questions that have come in. So the top question here is, have you both, ever faced a situation where the more accessible design resulted in poorer UI or UX for the majority of users? And if so, how did you handle it?
I think it's a great question, like, because it feels like accessibility sometimes feels like this trade-off between like, okay, you know, as we prioritize it for this group, like everyone else has to suffer. But in our experience, actually, that hasn't been the case at all. Because like when you're building for accessibility, and like it typically doesn't necessarily impact the experience like of like say the majority of users, so to say. When we talk about accessibility and the baselines to start with, we're looking at good color contrast. Like it's not hard to say good color contrast equal to better readability for everybody. So like unless you really go for the extremes, like it's hard to say that it results in a poorer UI UX. Making things more keyboard accessible, like, you know, the ability to tap through things through writing like good HTML, isn't going to make it worse for someone else. Like making things more screen reader accessible, having alternative text, all of these things, it wouldn't necessarily make things worse for anybody else. So like this is kind of a myth, I feel like, in accessibility work, that like making things more accessible equals to making things poorer for everyone else. So yeah, like starting from a baseline of like accessibility first oftentimes also helps you. So for example, one advice that we got from our friends at Google Accessibility was, okay, like what if you wrote your entire program or service like in HTML specifically, no CSS, no JavaScript, and then afterwards, like once that you see that it works for the group of people who use HTML primarily, then you can start layering the other things. And
Yeah, just to jump on that as well, really, it is a myth because this doesn't discount a great research as well. So if you are going to launch a accessibility feature, right, and you do want to test also the feature. So it is also very important to have your research hygiene here too. So if you realize that the thing that there's to have a trade-off, that is really quite a myth, because if you are testing, you also would see how your product works live with people. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind as well.
Interesting. Great. Okay, let's move on to the next question, which is, how do you tie in accessibility into your design system, or has there been any effort for you to do so?
yeah.
Great question.
And you want to take a stab, or?
I'll let the product designer take it.
Sure. So this is an ongoing journey. Like I wouldn't say that we've gotten it like figured out yet. Like, I think companies like say Google or Facebook or Microsoft like have it a lot more figured out than us. But for us, I think we are revamping sort of our design system at the moment, and consolidating the new components. So like I think we want to make sure that the components are accessible. For example, like having making sure that our ARIA labels are there and things like that at the component level will be what we'll be doing next.
Something Gloria mentioned earlier on with the previous question as well is like the really basics of accessibility, which is your color contrast and stuff, are something that you can already do even as you are building your design systems. So those little atoms really, you can start from there already. I think that's something if we really start as a basis, then there are the other complex stuff that we'll build on top of that.
Makes sense. Cool. Great. So moving right along, do the accessibility specific features make it to the MVP, and how do you prioritize at what stage they get baked in? That's a good question.
Yeah, definitely. For MVP, like we make sure that we roll out with a baseline level, right? And that baseline level for us, because it's a mobile thing, is screen reader compatibility. That's a huge one for us, because once you make things accessible for screen reader, like other assistive technologies that sort of like ride on top of that technology. So for example, braille controls or motor control related things will also automatically sort of become accessible. Yeah, like, and then the other thing that we prioritize is color contrast, like, because that's a really simple thing to start off with, and also comes from a design system angle. Then the other stuff, like, we slowly try to work through afterwards. So I guess like, also because our product is very much more content driven, we make sure that the main group of users we look at most of the time are the users with like visual impairment, and we start from there, and then subsequently motor impairment, and then sort of like subsequently we'll look more at like cognitive and like reading disabilities.
Yeah, I think it's also important to not get caught up in specific features. If you have to say that it's an accessibly specific feature, then you're kind of splitting between looking at your product serving the 100%. You know, when you're designing for the edges, right? To not just see it as let's design a specific feature for the community, but to see that you are serving all your users. So even looking at your baseline feature, right? Is that accessible? Yeah, because if the core value prop of your product has not taken in consideration accessibility, then I think we start from there first before thinking about building a specific feature for accessibility. I think that's a more important thing to think about, especially we are also starting our journey accessibility in Singapore, you know, and we know that it is a growing thing within Singapore, and we need to recognize that basic or even the core value prop has to be accessible before we talk about the larger features.
Korean, does that answer your question, or like is there something else you can okay.
Yeah, I think the reason why I found this question super interesting as well is because, you know, we were talking about how there's this myth of trade-offs, right? And actually, I think the trade-off usually isn't majority of users to, you know, people with accessibility needs, but it's trade-off in terms of time and resources for product development, right? Because if you want to have accessibility in your product, it needs time, it needs effort, it needs yeah, so that's kind of the times.
Jill, I think you brought up a good point around time and effort, right? And like one thing that we found is that like it's much less effort actually to bake it earlier, like from MVP, than like, you know, once a product has been rolled out and it's mature and you try to retrofit accessibility in. So counterintuitively, putting it a little bit more at the start actually results in much greater time saving in the long run.
Yeah. Actually, if you have time, just a very quick story. Right? So there was this story that was shared about planes. You know, so there was a study that did to find the perfect human being, right? And they designed a cockpit just for this person. Yeah. The fun fact was that a lot of planes crashed because of that, because there is no average human being, so you can design a cockpit to fit everybody. You know, and if you saw this, if you think about that story, right? If you try to bake accessibility afterwards, you know, it's about retrofit. If you really build the plane, your cockpit is not going to fit the plane if you retrofit it in. So it's very important that you design the plane, right? Well, even before you talk, well, it really prevents a downstream effect.
Gosh, that's a really interesting story. They were trying to build it for the perfect person. They should have asked.
Yeah, the average, like they did like 200 like Caucasian males. Yeah, and say, okay, this is the average, and they did like math behind that. So yeah, you know, you just average out, but humans aren't average. Yeah, and that's very important. You know, there is no average human being.
Yeah, I love that. I love that phrase. Okay.
I have a follow-up question.
Please.
Yeah. So regarding like baking in accessibility, that like, for example, if it's a very content-heavy screen with, and I like if I don't have to care about accessibility, I can prioritize elements, give it play around with the contrasting and all that. But if I need to pay attention to accessibility, right, then I have to keep in mind the baseline contrast, and I don't have much room for experimenting all the other lot of things and all that. But I just want to throw everything and test it out first, whether it works or not, and then later spend time thinking about it. Something like that.
Yeah, I definitely understand sort of that constraint. Like, oh yeah, you know, like if you need a minimum like contrast of this, it feels like a constraint kind of thing. I think like one thing is that as a designer, like firstly, I suppose that, you know, like working within the constraints, like arguably could possibly result like maybe in a more different and unintuitive solution. Like that's one. And the second thing is that sometimes like it's still like even for me personally, when I'm designing and like, you know, color contrast and things like that, like certain information that perhaps is like not like 100% crucial or whatever, like breaking those constraints a little bit here and there, like it's still not necessarily a totally like unacceptable thing, but it's more about just applying your discretion, like, and not necessarily feeling like it's a constraint that limits you and it's a requirement to fulfill, but more of like a condition in which you can come up with more creative ideas.
Yeah, also the myth is to make it to, there's some people may say like we want, so in WCAG, which is like kind of the W3Cs, like the consortiums, like recommendations, right? The goal is not to make everything AAA, but the goal is to make it minimum A. I think that's very important. I think like let's not also let our Singapore drive for like overdoing things, like get the best of us. I think it's very important that we also like start somewhere rather than to overdo it.
I guess that reminds me of the phrase like perfect is the enemy of good. Right?
Of good, yes.
Okay, well, there's this question here that has been a lot of upvotes suddenly. So let me read it. Could you talk more about the legal requirements of GovTech? I would guess in Singapore and all over the world, GovTech is all over the world in general, to be accessible, and are certain mainstream apps under legal requirements as well in Singapore?
Very good question.
You all know.
Okay.
Feels very legal.
I need to talk some more. Yeah, I need to talk to my lawyers first. I'm kidding.
The lawyers in the house that want to answer this question.
I think in the States, there is a lot more legislation because also the communities there are a little bit more well organized as well. In Singapore, I think legislation is something, first, I probably a bit hard for me to comment on, but there are like legal requirements across the world, specifically more in the States, maybe in the UK as well, that that companies can be fined if they do not meet a certain requirements. You can check it out on what's happening in the States. In fact, a lot of accessibility sites or organizations, right, do talk about the compliance level. For us, we are really looking on conformance in Singapore. I really believe that we want to use more carrot than stick. Yeah, although the stick does work, but I think if we only use a stick, that shows a lot about like design, right? We don't just use design to hit people, but we really want people to be motivated, to see people as people, to design for people. Yeah.
Yeah. So short answer, no, we don't have any legal requirements in Singapore at the moment. But it's sort of really about best practice.
Yeah, I wanted to add on something to this, which is like, aside from like the GovTech perspective of things, like if you're working on, so my experience is in like business software or enterprise software. In that world, there's a business requirement more so than a legal requirement, which is like, if you are creating products for companies and those companies have users who, you know, have accessibility needs, or they want to make sure that all their software is inclusive, you're going to lose that account. You're not going to get that contract. You're not going to get that business because you don't meet these requirements. So
absolutely, yes.
GovTech side, that's the legal side, but yeah, on when it comes to products like commercial products, there's a business requirement there.
So to the point for what Gio has mentioned as well, we were surprised also at how there are people from the PWD community that are actually using our business platforms for GovTech too, right? It's very important to realize that to not have an assumption that enterprise software will not be used by people from the PWD community. First, that's also really condescending. But I think the bigger thing is that there are people from the PWD community that own companies, that actually do accounts, and they are bosses themselves, and it's very important to build for them as well to widen that is a business requirement, and not only you're losing account, it also makes your range for business quite limited if you don't see it from a larger lens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and specifically from the GovTech perspective, like, you know, even though there's no legal requirement, like it's sort of our imperative, you know, as the government of Singapore, like to serve all, and that's sort of where we're coming from as well. But yeah, the business stuff, like you guys covered it really well.
Money, the money, the money, the money.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. I don't want to run over the hour for everyone. So the last question we have here, oh no, we have a tie. Okay, the last two questions, we answer it quickly. How do you measure success of implementing accessibility in design, and how do we start? For us noobs.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think we are also kind of growing in that side of the journey. I think we would use WCAG as one ruler of sorts, but I think like the measure of success, there are different measures of success. I think when you actually do meet your users from the PWD community, right, one measure of success is a very emotional measure of success. I think it's very important to see that the ROI of accessibility, it's a very long game. Yeah, sometimes what we have not shared is that there are stakeholders that may not believe in that yet, but that doesn't stop us from actually believing in it and building it anyway. But one measure of success is really to meet your users directly and see that how many people in that community you have impacted, that you have built a feature that they can use on a daily basis. That's one place to start.
Yeah. One of the interesting measures that we've heard, and also, I mean, to preface that as well, you know, like to the point that accessibility is a long game. Like, some people in our group sometimes ask, "Oh, how do we know that our product is fully accessible?" Right? Like I think we would like to say that there's no such thing as fully accessible, because what just happens as you implement more and more accessibility is that the problems of accessibility get more and more obscure and more specific and unique to each individual. So like if you see sort of that, like in a way, I think that's an indicator of maturity of your accessibility design. Like, are you working on sort of the, like, you know, basic problems like screen reader accessibility, or are you sort of like in this case where you maybe have a deafblind user who is also like in this particular scenario, like, and they cannot do this particular thing. So that's one. And then two is also like, are you getting feedback from your users? Because the more, like, I think one thing we're trying to measure is like the stake that these groups feel within the product, right? Like, are they willing like to give you the feedback? Because the more that they give you and the more that they don't see things change, the more they won't give you feedback in the future. Whereas like if you're actually implementing accessibility and catering for these user groups, you start seeing them becoming more vocal and more willing to give you feedback.
Yeah, so don't say the increase of feedback is a bad thing, because if they don't give you feedback, that is really bad news. That means you're losing a feedback loop. So when you see them giving more feedback, it's also meaning that they're using your product more. So that's actually good news.
Nice. Okay, last one. How can junior designers begin to learn and incorporate accessibility in their design?
I have a website. I'll just put it in the chat. I prepped that already. So there's this really lovely website called the Ally Project, or the A11Y Project. That's something that junior designers can check out. There's many resources out there. Yeah. Or chat with us over Twitter. We'll share with you the really big list of resources. We have labeled some things that you can start, where the basics are. So if you have scanned the QR code, that's really a great place to start.
Yes. And beyond reading about it, like finding ways to experience it yourself, like turn on voiceover and use it for whatever you're working on. Yeah, and volunteer with the communities you want to serve, and those would help too.
Do the safe entry, double pad thing.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think that's a great point to stop. So yes, as we mentioned before, we will be sharing out the list of resources that Gloria and Manny have so amazingly collated. We'll be sending it out to you, and I think Shuyan pasted it in the chat for the Zoom room as well, but we will send it out to you after the event. And I guess on behalf of everyone here, I just want to say a huge thanks to Gloria and Manny for the time that you took to prepare for this and the work that you do in GovTech. I think for all of us who have our own disabilities or who know people with disabilities, I mean, this is just such important work. and all of those who will eventually have disabilities, which, like you said, is everybody at some point in their life, temporary or permanent or whatever, situational. We will have the benefits of your work. So thank you so much for sharing about that today. And okay, cool. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, you. Thanks, Shane. Thanks, everyone.
Good luck, everyone.
Have a good
Bye.
day.
Ciao.
Have a happy day. Bye.
Bye.
Should we play the Sims music to like fade us out, or should we just sing it? What do you think, Gloria?
Oh, sing it. Joe, you're gonna do a karaoke.
No.
The Lego movie.
Yeah. A screen share.
I would love that.
Screen share, we'll do a movie sharing at 10:30 a.m.
Oh, we have some from Tokyo. Nice.
Hi.
Oh, wow. Hi.
Yes. I guess Tokyo is like same time zone, right? Yeah.
Ish, right? Yeah, +8.
Same-ish.
Maybe plus minus 1 hour.
Bye, Veronica. Thank you for your comment.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Bye. Wow, NYC.
Right? Like talk to us, right? Tingwan's gonna stay.
Tingwan, please appear.
Share her latest designs. Go do a
Yeah. Hey,
Tingwan.
she's here.
She's never gonna join again. Wow, Roland is on New York. Amazing. Wait, what time is it in New York? It's like middle of the night, 10 p.m.
Yeah,
Wow.
like 10:30.
Oh no, Tingwan, don't run away.
Yeah, it is 10:30.
Wow.
Thanks for tuning in so late.
Without Roland's reminder, this is still recording. I'm gonna have to crop it. And the back.
Lovely.
Yeah, okay, cool. I guess we will send out the links to everyone, and okay, this is my outro. Ding 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 ding.
Okay.
Bye y'all.
Bye. Thanks again.
Bye.